Welcome to part 8 of the series where we're rewriting the KidsCanCode series on shoot 'em up with Love2D, Monogame and Pygame, and today we're doing the Lua and Love2D version. This is the original section here. We are adding some explosions which apparently are not available anymore from opengameart, so I've put them on my repository here, which I'll put a link in the description. We've also got the code here under episode 8 explosions, Love2D, Monogame and Pygame, so the code is all there for you. The explosions are linked to in KidsCanCode, but it appears to go to his website, so rather than overloading his, get it off my GitHub one there. So let's go back to see exactly what we're doing today. So I'll get this moved across and we'll show you what we're doing. Hit the play button. So as you can see, the mobs are now being destroyed and explosions of various sizes showing up, and I will now allow myself to get pummeled, and there'll be a final explosion when my shield is gone down to 0. There we go. And as you may have noticed there, once the explosion animation and the sound had finished, then so did the game. We'll come back to the explosion class in a moment, but let me just show you how we're getting this in. So the image folder now has got a series of regular explosions and sonic explosions, which are on the file that I just indicated on my GitHub. I believe the one on the original KidsCanCode has only got these ones on for them. I think he puts these other ones on later, but I've kind of done it all in one go, so you're welcome to use those. So how do these work? Well, as before, when we are running this, we have to load everything in our love.load. So I've written a new function here called load animations, and that's what's going to load in these images. So here's the load animations. Let me just drop those out the way and increase the font a little bit. That's better. So in our usual way, we set up an explosions table at the top here. So we've got an explosions empty table, an explosion list empty table, and something called death explosion, which at the moment we've set to nil, so we'll explain all these later. So what we're doing initially is to put all the graphics into this table called explosions, and then the explosion list is where, once we've created an explosion, it's being held in that list in the same way as we have a mob list and a bullet list. So the explosions themselves are held here and the active explosions are held in there. So let's go back down to our new function here. So the explosions which was declared at the top there, we've added a sub table called mob and then another one called player, so we've got two lots of explosions in there. Then we're running a for loop. Now this time, although Lua is 1 base, not 0 base, the reason I've left it at 0 is because we're using the file name of the explosion. So if we take this one here, you'll see it's regular explosion 00.png. So we can call a file name regular explosion and then the value of I, which of course will start at 0 so that we can get the first explosion in PNG, and then we're going to insert that into the mob explosions, and set it up with the image stroke file name, so that we're adding into our explosions mob table all 8 of these regular explosions. And then in the same loop we're also doing another file name for the sonic explosions, for this is for the player. So in the same way we're adding the file name tag to it there, and then inserting that into the player explosions there. Now in the Pygame version we scaled and had so like 3 lists of explosions. We had a large explosion, a small explosion, and finally a player explosion. It's not necessary in Love2D because scaling the images on the fly is extremely simple, so it's easier just to put the explosions in one size and then deal with them later. So that's loading in our explosion images, so that each one of these, the explosions.player, will contain 8 images, and the explosions.mob will also contain 8 images. So that's put in the love.load. We're loading those in, and now of course we've got to play them. So before we do that, let me show you how the explosion class works. Just increase the font. So a typical Lua class, we've imported the class subclass here. We're making a new one called explosion, and we're including the rectangle. We don't need the circle in this one because we're these are just purely graphics that are showing stuff. They're not being interacted with, so we don't need colliders and things for this one. So we're supplying it with a sprite list, which is our list of images, the center where they should be drawn, and the scale, so that we can decide the scale at drawing time as to whether it's a large, small, or whatever. So we're setting up the center here, and then we're setting up the sprite list from what's being passed, and the scale. So these 3 are just being taken from the parameters that are passed and stored internally. And then the first image, we're taking sprite list 1. Now remember, this is Lua, so we don't use 0, we use a 1. That's the first image of our 8 in our table, which is acting as a list in this particular instance. We set the frame to 1, time passed 0, and the frame rate, I've set it to 0.05. I believe I had it as 0.1 in the Pygame version, so let's just change that just to match. Self-active equals true, and then we produce a rectangle based around the image width, heights, and the scale, so that the size of the rectangle is also being determined by the scale of the image that's being passed in. The update function uses delta time, as of course. So every 60 frames a second, the time passed, which was set at 0 up here, is increased by delta time, and then when the time passed reaches the frame rate, which we set at 0.1, then that means we're ready to display the next frame. So obviously if you set this to as it was originally 0.05, that means it's going to happen a lot faster than it does at 0.1. So this setting at 0.1 will make this explosion run for 0.8 of a second once it's gone through all 8 frames. So that allows you to alter things to suit yourself there. So the time passed is then reset to 0. The current frame, which was set originally at 1, is increased by 1. If the frame number is greater than the length of the sprite list, in other words, we've got 8 images, so if it goes above 8, then it's set to the last 1, and more importantly, the self.active is set to false. So this explosion is no longer active, it's run, all 8 frames have been shown, it's gone. So assuming that it's less than that there are still active images here, then we are moving on to the next frame here, showing the next frame here, because we've already set it back up here, and then we're updating the rectangle just to make sure that we're showing that image at the correct position, because each image is slightly wider, or yes, I believe they get wider as they go along, and then it shrinks again, so the rectangle size around each image does change. So this takes account of that and uses the scale to give the correct rectangle. And then finally, when it's time to draw it, if it's active, it will then draw the image at the X and Y position using the scale supplied. So this is the difference between the Pygame version and the Love2D version. We're actually drawing the images and scaling them on the fly, which works perfectly well with Love2D, but is not quite so easy in Pygame. So that's how the explosion class works. So what we're doing is to play a series of 8 images over a fixed length of time, and when the update, when we've played all 8 images, update returns false down here, and then the explosion is over, it's finished. So let's just close that down. Let's go back to main. So we've loaded them in, and now we've got to see how they work. So if we go to the update function here, let's do that. We've now got a new function in our update general sort of love.update one here, which is to update the explosions. It doesn't really matter where it's put. I've put it there, but it could go pretty much anywhere. It all happens so fast you're not going to notice any difference. So let's have a look at the update explosions. There we go, there it is. So again, using delta time. So we're using a for loop, and we are checking to see whether we're going through this for loop, and we're checking each explosion list item, so that if we've got several explosions because we've destroyed a number of mobs, then we're going to update each one. And let's just move that in, it's irritating me. That's better. It was out of place, and it was causing me massive confusion. Let's just put that back in. Right, so let's go back to the beginning. We've got a for loop here going through the list of explosions, and if we're trying to update each explosion, if it doesn't update because it's come to the end, then we remove it from the list of explosions. That's how that one works. Now these of course is purely for the mobs being hit, and let's see how the updates, how the mob actually produces an explosion in the first place. So if we go back up here, so we're going to the check mob bullet collisions. So when a bullet hits a mob, it's going to explode. We've already done the audio for that. The score, this is the audio down here. So this is now going to add an explosion for the mob when it's hit by a bullet. So we insert into the explosion list a new explosion based on the mob itself, so that will pass its center, and then we're passing in a table, which is why we've got the curly bracket here and here, of the bullet list rectangle center. So this is passing the top of the bullet list as well, so that we've got the explosion occurring at the top of the bullet here. I believe in the Pygame version I used the center of the mob. I'm not sure which looks better. Judge for yourself. You can, of course, instead of passing in the top center of the bullet, you could pass in the top center of the mob, but you'd have to do that before you set the properties of the mob, because that's returning it back above to the top of the window. So I think that's probably why I chose to use the bullet list here. So I'm just experimenting to see what looks better. So the explosion is going to start at the top of the bullet as it hits the mob. So that will pass that in and produce a new explosion, which will then of course be updated in the update explosions, and once it's finished playing it'll go. So that's the kind of cycle for that one. Now when the mob hits the player, we've got a different explosion that's going to occur, so that will be in the check mob player collisions. So as before, we were already checking whether the player intersects with a mob, and then we would play a sound, and then if the player's shield gets less than or 0, then we know we're dead, so we play the die sound. Alive is set to false, and now we set up our death explosion, which was just a singular, it's not a list, it's just a single object, to a new explosion using the player explosion list of images, and then we're passing in again in a table the player's rectangle X, width over 2 and rectangle Y, so that the explosion appears to start at the top center of the player as it goes across, and that is the scale. So we've set that at normal, like full scale. That's why it's a bigger one, whereas the size of the explosion for mobs up here, just move that across, is at 0.5, so that's half size. So that's why there's a difference in the explosion size. Let's see, process events is exactly the same. And again, with in the update there, if the death explosion is not nil, in other words the player's been hit, it's in the process of exploding, then it will allow us to play all 8 frames until the explosion has finished. Then it's set to nil again, and then as long as that's nil, if we with our mob player collisions, there we go. So what we're checking is if the player is alive, just do everything as normal. If it's not, we've been hit, our alive has been set to dead, the death explosion is graphics are playing, and the sound, the die sound, is also playing. So this kind of checks both things. Is the death explosion nil? It means yes, the explosion has finished. So now just check the die sound. Is that finished? Yes, it is. Okay, game state quit. So it kind of is all logical, but it's a little bit complicated. So let's just go through that again. We'll play it. Let's just save everything and play that. Okay, so as you can see, when I hit mobs, they explode. Yes, I think I like the 0.1 setting so that these explosions last a little bit longer. That's quite nice. Now, when we get constantly hit, which I'll allow myself to do, when the shield goes, we will explode, and there we go. And then the game finishes. So that's explosions in Love2D.